Welcome back to Train Signal. You're watching Active Directory Forest Design and Functional Levels for brand new networks and upgrade fun. In this video, we're going to talk about how to plant an Active Directory forest. And we'll go through the differing elements and such. And then we're also going to talk about domains and trees in the forest. We'll talk about how we may want to plan out our domains in the trees. And then we'll also talk about to upgrade or to not upgrade. Those are going to be some good questions that we're going to need to ask. And I'll talk with you about functional levels of Server 2003 and 2008. Then we also need to talk about sites and what kind of role that might play in your overall network design. So once you feel like you got your head wrapped around the whole forest and domain thing, then we'll bring up yet another new topic that you'll need to consider in your planning process. So first, let's start off by talking about how to plant a forest, and we're going to start off by talking about domains. Now, you probably already know this, but really a forest at the end of the day is really made up of domains, and that's what we need to keep in mind. Now, I know that this is a blinding flash of the obvious, but it's something that needs to be said right up front. Now, here's something to also consider. You're probably very familiar with the fact that a domain is a unit of administration, and we can administrate our network according to domains and divvy out the different responsibilities to network administrators based upon domains, but it's also a unit of replication. And this is something that I want you to keep in mind as we talk through this section all the way throughout. Creating domains really allows you to determine how much information between domain controllers gets replicated. And that's really going to be a big deal, especially if you have domains in various locations and if you have slow or if you have WAN links that are slow, because you don't want to be sucking up all of your bandwidth from replication traffic. Your users actually have real work to do, and so we don't want to necessarily eat up any resources other than what we absolutely have to for replication between domain controllers. Now, if you're fortunate enough to design from the beginning, this is something that you may or may not have the luxury to do, just so you know. You may end up having to redesign a forest and domain structure. You'll need to first determine whether to use a single forest or multiple forests in your whole organization, your enterprise. Now, a single forest, just so you know, is best for most situations. It's probably what you'll find the most in most places. A single forest simply has the domains that are absolutely required for your organization, as you see down here in the diagram. Now, multiple forests are good if you have multiple divisions that are either autonomous or if you have a necessity for high security, or also if you have squabbling system administrators who don't trust each other. This is also a good reason why you might want to have multiple forests essentially isolated, or maybe you might have a forest trust in there. Multiple forests can provide for isolation of data at a very high level, obviously, and it really provides you with the ability to have strict control of the resources in each forest. Of course, multiple forests are probably going to have multiple domains in them, so you are going to be adding some additional complexity in there and probably having additional manpower to provide administration for the multiple forests. Now, let's talk about the different kinds of forests, though. Before you jump headlong into one or the other, there's a couple of different ways that you can design a forest model. And what you see here on the screen is an organizational forest model. Now, with an organizational forest model, it's going to contain user accounts and resources in the same domain, and each domain in the forest is managed separately. You're going to find this the most often because it's probably the easiest to build, it's probably the easiest to create, and if you have multiple administrators, it's probably the easiest to administer too. Each domain is still going to maintain control of its own users and resources. Now, what you see on the screen, obviously, is going to be a forest that has multiple domains, probably in multiple locations even, or even if it's at one location, maybe you might have a separate domain in your forest for each department, or maybe you have separate domains when you need to have more control over the security in one or more particular domains. All right, let's talk about the resource forest model, in which we have a forest trust. Now, a resource forest model, basically what we're going to end up with, let me break out my pencil here and kind of draw on the screen a little bit. A resource forest model is going to have all of your users in one forest, or really in a domain in in the forest. Obviously, you're going to have at least a couple of servers over here, but then all of the resources that your users are going to need to access are going to be in a completely separate forest. And we provide a forest trust between the two in order to allow our users in one forest to access resources in the other forest. Now, you might be kind of scratching your head at this point and say, why would I ever do this? Well, if you need exclusive control and you need a great deal of security over your resources, this might be the best go. You're probably not going to find this in very many places, though. Only in environments where you have a great need for massive amounts of security. Now, let's talk about a restricted access forest model, somewhat similar to the resource, except that basically you have two completely separate forests with no trust, but your organization is going to own both forests. Okay, so what we're really talking about here is basically having ownership of the two Active Directory forests and being able to administer them. And again, this is valuable when you have a massive need for extremely tight security. Let's say you're working for a defense contractor and you need to have different divisions working on separate components of, say, oh, I don't know, a missile or whatever, or a time machine, and you don't want either division to know what the other's working on. Well, when you have a restricted forest type of model, it's very easy to ensure that one user from one forest cannot access information in the other forest. They're really essentially in two completely separate worlds, if you will, in terms of the Active Directory database. All right, so now that we've talked about the kinds of forests that you might encounter, then let's also talk about the trees in your forest. Now, a forest is made up of trees. I know, again, another blinding flash of the obvious here, but trees are made up of domains. And so what you might find in some networks that you will encounter in your IT career, you're going to find that some forests are going to have trees with multiple domains, as you see here. You're going to have your forest root up top, and your forest root is going to maybe have one or two trees. You might have, let's say this is Southwest, and let's say you might have a Dallas subdomain, or let's say that's some beautiful artwork there, Coach. Let's say that the Southwest domain initially lives in Austin, but you have a branch office in Dallas. So let's say that this is Austin. So this domain down here might be something like dal.sw.globomantics.com. All right, so whatever that might look like. But this is what you're probably going to find the most in very large organizations, and that's something to be conscious of when you're planning out your domain and forest structures, is that if you have a very small organization, this may not be the best go for you. What you might need is a small environment that might have one forest with one tree, or really one domain. You might have maybe two domains or whatever it is. But if you work in a 10-man shop and you have 10 folks in your shop, you don't need a huge forest structure. You don't need a huge domain structure. All you need is one forest root domain, probably, maybe one subdomain if you have nothing else better to do with your time. But in a small environment, you don't need something crazy like what we have over here. You need something very simple. And by the way, when it comes to network design, that's really a key that you will want to remember. Keep it as simple as you possibly can. The more domains that you put into a forest, the more trees that you have, the more permissions issues you're going to encounter, the more trust stuff that you need to consider. There's all kinds of considerations when you start to break out your Active Directory into multiple domains. A single domain is always going to be the easiest and the most efficient to administer. However, if you have a large amount of folks in your shop, the single domain environment, a small one forest, one tree, one domain kind of thing, probably isn't going to cut it. You're probably going to have to increase the size of your Active Directory network depending upon what your requirements are. And those requirements might be, you might need to have domains built and based upon your department functional levels. And we're going to talk more and more about this. But if you can, keep your domain structures as simple as you possibly can. If you can't, well, then you're going to have to build some stuff out. And again, this is all going to depend upon the requirements of the organization. It's going to depend upon what your management says. And sometimes your managers are going to tell you stuff that it doesn't make sense. And that's just part of living the IT lifestyle. Let's talk a little more about different kinds of trees, what you might end up with. When we're starting to look at your domains and your trees, and I've told you this before, a single domain in a forest, it's very good for small networks. If you have large decentralized networks, it really is not good because you're going to need different components and different types of permissions. There's all kinds of other considerations for large decentralized networks. It is, again, the easiest scenario, and any domain controller can authenticate any other user in the domain. It's a very simplistic structure, best for small shops, and if you can get away with it, I say go for it. But however, you need to understand that it does generate the most replication traffic. Now, when you have multiple domain controllers in a domain, they are going to be using some of your bandwidth to replicate information back and forth to each other. They are going to be trading and talking all throughout the workday, especially when you start making a lot of changes. So in a small shop, however, it's not nearly as critical because chances are you're probably already running a pretty fast LAN network. You're probably running at least 100 megabits or if not gigabit. And if that's the case, you don't have to worry about this so much. However, the larger your environment gets, the more domain controllers that you add to your environment, the greater the need for multiple domains in your forest. And part of that reason is administrative, and part of that reason is replication too. All right, let's talk about having multiple regional domains. And what you see here, you might have a single forest environment, but you might have 3 domains based upon the region so that you can control regional access with multiple administrative staff. So you might have 3 separate network administrators, one for New York, one for Chicago, and one for Dallas. Now there's reasons for this, especially when it's based upon geographical area and you are going across wide distances over a WAN link. It does reduce replication traffic, especially when you have multiple domain controllers. Let's say we have 3 or 4 domain controllers here in New York, 3 or 4 domain controllers in Chicago, and 3 or 4 domain controllers in Dallas. Well, those domain controllers are only going to talk to each other in their particular domain. So not nearly as rough on your bandwidth than if you had, say, 12 domain controllers in your environment, especially when the connections between, let's say that you have a slow connection between New York and Dallas. In that case, we're going to be creating multiple domains, not only so we can have a separate set of administrators for Dallas and New York, but also so that the replication between Dallas and New York doesn't become cumbersome. This is really good for large decentralized networks for multiple locations, and again, blinding flash of the obvious, right? And it also allows for easy delegation of administrative duties to regional administrators. It's going to allow you to pass the buck, if you will, and so you don't have to do everything. All right, let's talk about multiple functional domains. And when we're talking about functional domains, you have similar benefits as a regional domain structure in which you can have multiple network staff administrating in the different departments. You also get the advantage of reducing your replication traffic, but it's really based upon your functional departments in your corporation, in your organization. Now, the reason why you might want to make this a reality is to essentially allow for more administrative flexibility in terms of having different requirements for the different departments. Obviously, your research and development network is going to have much different requirements than your accounting network. Your accounting network might have very strict security requirements in terms of the data that's being processed. Your research department may have different security requirements due to the work that they're doing, and then your administrators are going to have different security requirements and different resources available to them. So you can use this in a decentralized location scenario, especially if your administrative staff, accounting staff, and research staff are in completely different buildings in different locations. Now that's not a bad idea, but it can also be used in large central locations. Let's say that you have a campus. Let's say you have a very large area that your corporation is spread out over, and maybe you have different buildings on the campus, but regardless, this might be an easier way to manage and provide all of the benefits of a regional domain structure, but provide the different resources and capabilities for each of your individual functional departments. All right, so now that we have talked about the different kinds of forest structures, the different kinds of tree structures that you can have inside of your forest, let's move on. Let's talk about to upgrade or to not to upgrade. And the biggest question here is, are you going to have only Windows Server 2008 machines as domain controllers, or are you also going to have older server operating systems on your domain controllers as well? Now, I've listed out here for you, let me break out the pen again here, listed out for you the different features for the differing functional levels in terms of domains. And this is not an exhaustive list, just so you know, and also does not include the forest functional level capabilities, but these are going to be the ones that you're going to be most concerned with. If you have any domain controllers that are still Server 2000, you can only operate, no matter how many Server 2003 or Server 2008 domain controllers you may have, you're only going to be able to operate with these features, which, okay, is pretty good. But Server 2003, let's say you have a mixture of Server 2003 domain controllers and Server 2008 domain controllers. Well, if that's the case, you're only going to be able to operate with these particular features. They are improvements over having only a Server 2000, but if it is possible, okay, and this may or may not be possible for your environment that you're working in, but a Server 2008 functional level is going to give you the greatest amount of features and functionality, including things like distributed file system replication for your sysvol replication. That's just using distributed file system for your replication. Here's one of the biggest things, though. You can get stronger encryption for authentication using Kerberos. So if you have a stronger security requirement set, this is going to be the way to go for you. Probably the biggest one, though, and this is going to be probably not so much for very secure locations, but probably a general corporation that isn't doing, say, top secret work on teleportation. Fine-grained password policies. In order for you to use fine-grained password policies, you should know what those are by now. You have to be at a Server 2008 functional level. If you're not, fine-grained password policies are not going to be available to you. So, knowing all of this, let's say that you are in an older network. Let's say you're in a Server 2003 network, and you have users who their security requirements are less due to either their job function, or maybe they're just, how do we say this nicely? They're forgetful. In that case, if we want to simplify the password policies for certain groups of users, we're going to have to upgrade all of your domain controllers to Server 2008. Now, can you have Server 2003 servers performing other functions? Yes, you can. That's not a problem. Functional level is only determined by the domain controllers. Which operating system are you using on your domain controllers? If it's Server 2000, 2003, you are limited. If you have any at all, Server 2000 or Server 2003 domain controllers in your network anywhere, then you are not going to be able to raise the functional level of your domain to Server 2008 and get the additional security and the additional benefits that Server 2008 provides. Now, obviously, this is going to be more of a question of budget and probably time too, because when you are upgrading your servers to Server 2008, you have to plan for stuff to, well, it shouldn't blow up, but it might. Okay, I mean, let's just get real. Anytime you upgrade or you do a new rollout of a new operating system, there's going to be bumps in the road. Now, sometimes there's not if you're lucky, but sometimes, especially when you have custom written applications for your environment and you upgrade to Server 2008, hopefully that application will work, but maybe it won't. Okay, so if you have that kind of scenario, especially if that application is living on a Server 2003 machine that is also a domain controller, well, we're going to have to think really hard about this process of upgrading. On the flip side, if you're only using Microsoft-based applications, then you might have a better chance of having everything work when you do upgrade your server. So that might be a good thing to remember. But remember, in order to get to the Server 2008 features, only your domain controllers, all right, have to be Server 2008. I think I have ingrained that into your brain now. So let's go on and let's continue talking about sites next. Now, sites can be fun if you have the appropriate infrastructure. Sites are really your true unit of replication. You can really control how much replication happens with domains. But with sites, they control when replication happens and which domain controller replicates to which domain controller. So when you add in sites to represent the physical nature of your network, you do get more control. Okay, so that's what I want you to think about when you start thinking about sites. Sites do provide you with more control and provide a better representation in your Active Directory database of the physical topology of your network. Now, when you build out sites, it does require your physical infrastructure to be broken into subnets, and you need to have appropriate switches and routers at each particular location where you have an Active Directory site. So if you're going to be utilizing different geographical locations as well as different domains, your physical infrastructure has to be in place first. Once your physical infrastructure is in place, then you need to also utilize in Active Directory subnets and subnet objects in Active Directory. And that's something that already you should be familiar with from your days of learning Active Directory. All right, so some more site stuff here. Now, you can have multiple sites in a single domain if you have just a crazy amount of domain controllers in one particular location. Now, that's not going to be very common, but just in case you find yourself in that kind of position, just understand that you can have multiple sites. So you might have a site for each individual floor of your building. So let's say you have a 5-story building. You might create 5 separate sites in your Active Directory based upon the physical structure of your network topology. Now, I should probably also mention that it's going to work just fine if you have multiple domains as well. But I mean, if you have very small offices, then simply having sites might be enough for your network topology. Let's say you have 3 10-person offices spread across 3 different locations. Do you need an individual domain for each of those small locations? No, you don't. What you do need to do probably is have a pretty decent speed LAN link between the 3 sites, sure. But you don't necessarily need a whole separate domain for a different geographical location, especially if you only have a few people in each location. So keep that in mind, that the size of the network is really going to determine what you're going to do with the sites and forests and domains and all of that. Now, if you work in a single forest, single domain environment and you only have a couple of domain controllers, a single site environment is always going to be the easiest. So again, working in a small shop, there's a lot of advantages to that. And not the least of which is the ability to utilize a single forest, single domain, and a single site structure in order to manage the stuff on your network. But you're still going to have a lot of control over what happens in your network based upon permissions and all that good stuff. Now, here's a little caveat, and I wanted to throw this in here just to kind of make you go, You can also have multiple domains in a single site. And again, I'm sure you're thinking, why would I do this? What does that make? How does that make any sense? It's not very common, all right? Just so you know, it's not one of those things you're probably going to see a lot, especially in today's day and age. But I just want to let you know that you can have multiple domains in a single site. And for something like a large campus, you may only have a single forest, single domain environment. You may have multiple domains, but in a physical topology, you may only have a single site that you're actually utilizing. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to that, and each one of your domains is probably going to have a very small amount of people. Again, working in a very, very secure type of environment, this might be the case. But again, it's just not something that you're going to see, all right? But I did want to mention it and throw it in here just so you know that that is possible. Now let's talk about site links. Okay. Now site links really create what we call the replication topology. Now a site link essentially creates replication partners between different sites. So if we have a domain, let's say we have a couple of domain controllers here in the New York site, a couple of domain controllers in the Chicago site, and a couple of domain controllers in the Dallas site. Using site links, we can say, okay, Dallas, I want you to talk only to the New York site whenever you're replicating, and Chicago, I want you also to only talk to the New York site, but we don't necessarily want them talking to each other. Let's say that, like in Globomantics, our main headquarters is in New York. Well, this is a good topology probably to have because Dallas and Chicago don't necessarily need to know information about each other. Now, we also have these things called site link bridges. And let me get rid of my pen here for a second so we can bring that up. There we go. A site link bridge basically allows for transitive rerouting of replication with necessary. Now, let me tell you what that means because I know it's kind of a mouthful. A site link bridge, what it does is, let's say that this particular link goes down between Dallas and New York, and it's time to replicate changes back to the New York site. Well, we can create a site link bridge that will allow rerouting of information about Active Directory and the changes that need to happen during replication over here to Chicago, and then Chicago will then turn around and send those changes over to the New York site. So think of a site link bridge as kind of a fallback plan in case one of your connections to a particular location happens to go down. Now, obviously, if you're working in a small environment, you probably won't need site link bridges because you probably only have one site. Or if you have only 2 domains or only 2 sites, well, site link bridges go out the window. When you start getting into 3 domains or sites, let's say we have 3 domains with 3 different sites in them, then the game changes, and we need to have kind of a fallback plan for replication just in case a link goes down. All right, so now let's put all this together and let's take a look at the Globomantics Active Directory structure over in the United States. We're going to start off with one forest. Now, Globomantics is not a huge company as of yet, so we can get away with one forest, and we're probably going to go with 2 domain trees with a regional domain model. It's a very common way to set up an Active Directory forest and tree structure. So Globomantics.com is going to be our forest root domain. We're going to have 2 trees, na.globomantics.com and then sw.globomantics.com as well. These 2 trees and the domains in those 2 trees actually represent the 2 different locations, na.globomantics.com being in Chicago and sw.globomantics.com being in Texas. With Globomantics, we're going to state that we're going to have a Server 2008 functional mode for both the forest functional level and the domain functional level. All we're going to have in our entire forest are Server 2008 machines. That's going to provide us a lot of advantages in terms of, again, the whole security thing and utilizing fine-grained password policies. Fortunately, Globomantics has a rather large budget. It's a very profitable company, and we can afford to do that sort of thing. Now, we're going to be creating 3 domains here, as you obviously see, to reduce replication traffic over the WAN links, but probably more so, that's an important thing, yes, because we don't want our bandwidth being sucked up by replication, but we also want to provide regional administration. We want to have an administrator in New York at Globomantics.com, one in Chicago at NA, and one in Texas down in the SW region. So that's really the kind of the thought process that while I was building out this whole Globomantics scenario, this would be my preferred methodology to build out a network. Also, we're also going to include 3 sites to control inter-site replication, which is going to happen after business hours. So when changes do happen in New York, those changes don't get replicated to Chicago and Dallas until business hours are over. So we're going to provide additional control over our replication traffic by creating 3 separate sites, one for each domain. Now, Globalmatics also is not a huge company. It's, kind of a small to medium-sized outfit. So right now, only 3 sites are more than sufficient. We have 3 locations in 3 regions, each with their own administrative domain. This is looking, pretty good. We're not going to have a huge amount of complexity with this kind of structure. So one more time, I just want to repeat this, and I do want to give my colleague Ed Lieberman for coming up with this great phrasing for this. Domains are, yes, they are an administrative unit primarily, but domains are also a unit of replication, and domains control how much gets replicated, whereas sites determine when things get replicated and to who they get replicated to. So sites and domains are critical building blocks to your Active Directory infrastructure. You have to have them appropriately in place to control both administration and the whole replication thing. All right, so let's go ahead and let's wrap up this video. After watching this video, you should be able to identify the types of forest models that are available with Microsoft Server 2008, identify the types of tree and domain models, describe the advantages of both single and multiple domains, and describe the use of sites in a forest design. There's one more thing that I want to verbally include. You should also be able to describe some of the advantages to upgrading to Server 2008 that you do not have with Server 2003. As a quick review, some of those things are fine-grained password policies. If you want to take advantage of fine-grained password policies, which, by the way, what that really does, just in case you've been hiding under a rock and you're not familiar with it yet, fine-grained password policies allow you to create password policies for specific users or groups that can either have an increased amount of security and stipulations on what kind of passwords they can create, or a decreased amount of stipulations on the passwords they can create. But the nice thing about that is that in the past, with Server 2000 and 2003, in order to have different kinds of password policies for our users, we had to create entirely different domains, because each domain had one password policy object only. With Server 2008 and the Server 2008 functional level, on the other hand, we can have password policy objects specifically for individual users even, or specific groups of users if you want to go that way as well. So some significant advantages to upgrading your domain controllers to Server 2008, but again, it is going to depend upon your budget and how much time that you have if you're going to be upgrading any Server 2003 domain controllers in your network, if you're working on the older network, or if you're going to be buying and building a brand new network. You might want to go ahead and jump into Server 2008 and catch all of the advantages that the Server 2008 functional level does provide. All right, well, that wraps up this video, friends. I'll see you in the next one.